question, unreliable story, isn't the Bible just a book of myths? Now, the Bible is one of the most influential texts in the history of the world, and in fact, it's been incredibly influential in the history of our nation, so this is a great question to be asking anyway. But it's especially important for us to ask this question, or at least be open to your questions about this question, as we put on this week. Story Durham's a week in which we're looking to share stories and hear and engage with your story and share how we have found the Christian story a life-giving, liberating thing. And so all this week in this marquee, we're hearing talks about what Jesus offers, many of them looking at the Bible to do that. And is it worth doing? Is the Bible reliable? If people can write this text off as nothing more than myths, then are we just wasting your time? I certainly used to think that, and I remember thinking that Richard Dawkins had put it very well when he said this in The God Delusion. To be fair, much of the Bible is not systematically evil, but just plain weird, as you would expect of a chaotically cobbled together anthology of disjointed documents, composed, revised, translated, distorted, and improved by hundreds of anonymous authors, editors, and copyists. That's his accusation. This book is a mess. It's a cobbled together, heavily altered thing. And even if you wouldn't put it in terms quite that pungent, maybe you're thinking, can anyone trust this book? Surely not today, surely not in the 21st century. I certainly remember thinking that myself. But as I started to investigate Jesus, I found that I had to take this book seriously. And in the short time we have together this lunchtime, I want to share a few reasons why I thought that and still do. Now, as I say, this is a huge question about a huge book. Put together over centuries, it encompasses many different writers and genres, and we'll have lots of Q&A, so please do ask any questions you've got. But we do have to start somewhere. So I'd like us to begin by looking at the text we call the New Testament, and focusing on those because they're the texts that say the most about Jesus, and the text we're probably going to look at most this week. And this is a live question. Jesus is a name on billions of lips today. People sing about him, they talk about him, some people even say they talk to him. He's left his mark on every continent, on every sphere of life, on every kind of person. So who was he? Now, there's no shortage of opinions and ideas out there. Many will tell you that he was a moral teacher, an influential sage. Muslims will tell you about Isa, a prophet of Allah who never claimed to be the Son of God. Dan Brown and people like him, if you ever read the Da Vinci Code, will tell you about an eccentric and charismatic Jewish leader who was exaggerated and inflated over centuries of Chinese whispers. But Christians, because they take the Bible seriously, view Jesus of Nazareth as nothing less than the Son of God. And they think that his vast claims and his, in their opinion, matchless life and then death and then resurrection set him apart. So whose presentation of Jesus is right? How would we know? Are the Christians right to be taking these New Testament writings seriously? Or as so many say, are there a bunch of fakes and forgeries, myths made up after the fact? Now, as a Christian, I definitely believe that the Bible is more than a human-authored document, and you should certainly ask me about that if you've got questions. But as we get into it this lunchtime, it is not less than that. And so it's entirely fair for us to be asking those kinds of historical questions about these texts. Are they early enough and coherent enough to be taken seriously? Now, for quite a long bit of the 19th century, the prevailing view was no. The New Testament texts were written very late. And in fact, they were only really put together at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. And if you wanted to underline that view, you could appeal to the fact that the earliest complete Bible we have, found in the Codex Sinaiticus, is only really there in AD 330. That's 300 years after the events they describe. So would we be right to stay in the 19th century and bin the Bible's claims? Well, actually, in the past 150 years or so, a whole academic discipline called manuscript criticism has emerged and matured. And as archaeological findings have unearthed more and more to look at, decades of research from all kinds of scholars, both with and without religious conviction, have been spent poring over the Bible's historical claims. And as a result, we simply have to abandon the idea that these writings were written much, much later than the first century. Let me take you to our first physical fragment of the New Testament. It's called Papyrus 52, and you can see it in the Rylands Library in Manchester. It's from John's Gospel, the book that Glenn was reading from last night. And it was found in Egypt. And the thing is, the way the Greek was written, we can tell from the handwriting that it's dated to about AD 125. That is less than a century after the events it describes, but much more excitingly, it's only about 35 years after the book itself is thought to have been written. That's hugely impressive because many people used to think that John's Gospel was written last of all, and perhaps the latest, centuries later. But nobody thinks that now. In fact, when we look at the New Testament, we have an embarrassment of riches. When we're investigating the ancient world, a key part of the evidence we look at is ancient documents, ancient manuscripts. And the fact is there aren't many for us to look at today, partly because not many survived, they were very fragile, but also because they were incredibly expensive to produce and to copy out. Now, a graph like the one I'm about to put on the screen, put together by a man called Josh McDowell, shows us, by way of comparison, how rare these ancient manuscripts are. And normally, when you look at the writings of antiquity, you find two things. Firstly, there's a huge gap between when they were first written and our first physical copy of that writing. And secondly, you find there's really quite a small number of copies for us to peruse. So we don't have many texts to check and compare against one another. But with the New Testament, we're in a totally different position. The gap between the text being written and our first physical copy is minuscule. As little as 35 years with John's Gospel and that first fragment. And the number of copies we have to investigate is massive, in the thousands. So we can probe and work at the text with many sources at our disposal. In fact, because we have so many of these copies, we can be very confident that what we have is what they wrote. And as you look down the chain of transmission, you're able to work out where it was the little changes crept in. And of course, the more people copied this, the more changes there were. If I asked everyone here to write out the New Testament, don't worry, that would take ages, we're not going to do it, then I'm sure lots of little variations would emerge. But the thing that's fascinating is most of these variations are tiny points of grammar, little bits of word order, and even the most hostile voices in the academy to the Christian faith have to acknowledge that after all these years of study, not a single claim in the Christian faith, not a single fact about Jesus of Nazareth has had to be altered. Now, none of what I've just said automatically means it's all true, but it does mean that these are fantastically reliable historical sources. And when we come to when those writings were first penned themselves, the dates are very early. All four Gospels are placed between 40 to 60 years of the events they describe. And I'm not using the sort of in-house conservative Christian dating there. I'm talking about the kind of dating that all kinds of scholars would do on these texts. Further back even than that, you have the letters of Paul, the earliest of which is something like 48 AD. And if you were interested, scholars reason as they look at Paul's letters that many of the writings he's put together include pre-Paul sources that he's put in, little smatterings of creeds and Christian poetry that he's quoting that his readers would already have known. So these letters show us that as early as that, the early Christians were talking about Jesus having died and risen again, and talking about him in terms which are divine. At this point, you might be wondering about the other Gospels. Some people call them the Gnostic Gospels. They're a bit of a tabloid favourite, and if you ever read the Da Vinci Code, they're basically the driving plot vehicle. Do ask questions about them if you've got them, but just briefly for now, the reason why they never found their way into the Bible as we have it is not because of some shady conspiracy. It's because of history. The very, very earliest one of them could have been written is AD 175. And actually most of the rest of them were written 200, 300 years later. But the texts that are in the New Testament are written well within living memory. The gap between what Jesus said and did and our first writings about it is as little as 15 years. And it's certainly not big enough for there to be a big period of Chinese whispers and myth-making. 15 years. Now, maybe some of you are a bit too young to remember what you were doing 15 years ago, but at my decrepit age of 26, I can remember. And I can tell you, that is just not a long enough period of time for someone to cook up a huge, outrageous myth and get many people to believe in it. So the New Testament documents, they are the earliest sources we have about Jesus. And no serious historian can just dismiss them outright. We have what was written. But then we wonder, is what was written worth taking seriously? Well, here's the next thing I found as I investigated these texts. The writers claim to report what people saw and heard and experienced. Here's how another account of Jesus' life, written by a doctor called Luke, begins. He writes, "Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you've been taught." He's reporting eyewitness testimony, or so he says. The claim is that what they wrote is what real people saw, heard, and experienced. It's a massive claim, but it is testable. It is falsifiable. Unlike a fairy tale which begins once upon a time, the writers of the New Testament are claiming to write history. And they litter their writings with all kinds of details, names of people, names of places, things you can test. That seems to be very important to them. If you've ever read the Quran, you'll know that it doesn't have any of those features. It's not invested in that kind of reportage. But the New Testament is. And so there are lots of ways that you can test it. Archaeology has proven to be one of them. For example, in chapter 5 of John's Gospel, Jesus heals a lame man at a pool called Bethesda. And up until the 19th century, people used to scoff at that. They thought this was a clear sign that John didn't know what he was writing about, because they'd never found a pool like that. But then in the 1930s, some archaeologists discovered it, with the pillars, just as described. And so people had to stop scoffing. That's one detail, and actually there are many more instances of how archaeology has proven these texts to be historically reliable. And there are lots of other things we could mention too. There's corroboration from other ancient sources, and people have done a fascinating study into the degree of accuracy with which personal names are used. Now, we need to explain this somehow. If the New Testament writers aren't telling the truth, how is it they keep getting it right? Especially given that Jerusalem is sacked and largely destroyed in AD 70. How do they keep getting little details and little touches that only eyewitnesses should know, unless they were? So you might be thinking, okay, so it's early, they're eyewitnesses, but weren't they all Christians? Why should I take what they say seriously? Won't they be biased? Well, we do actually have non-Christian writers who refer to Jesus, people like Pliny and Tacitus and Josephus and the writings in the Babylonian Talmud. And one of the things I found interesting when I read them as a skeptic is that a common theme in those writings is that Jesus did perform miracles. They're actually portrayed as sorcery, something evil, but I remember finding that telling. I remember thinking as a skeptic that far more damning to the Christian case would be no mention of Jesus at all, or a mention of Jesus stripped of his supposedly supernatural career. But actually all of those sources about Jesus I've named, they do come much later than the writings in the New Testament. And I want to say, perhaps shockingly, the fact that the early Christians were biased is one of the reasons why we ought to take them very seriously as historians. Of course, everyone is biased. We know this. There's no such thing as neutral history. Everyone writes with an agenda. But the fact that the early Christians were writing from theirs is very significant. Are you familiar with that phrase, history is written by the winners? I think we understand it. The idea is that those who win, those with the power, they control the narrative. They present things from their perspective. But when you read the earliest Christian writings, you're reading history written by the losers. Their message was deeply unpopular. The Jewish nation in which Christianity was born was totally hostile to this upstart messianic cult. And the Roman Empire in which it grew became more and more hostile in putting down this movement. What you have when you read the New Testament is the writings of those who had nothing to gain by writing what they wrote and standing by it, and had everything to lose. And in fact, many of them did, losing even their lives. Their accounts are full of details you wouldn't include if you were trying to start a movement. For example, the first leaders of that little movement, this little fledgling, fragile movement, they're not portrayed in these texts as heroic and courageous. They're portrayed as inept and kind of hopeless when you read them. Why would you invent details like that if you were trying to convince people? Why invent any of it at all when it costs you so much to stand by these claims? The word of the year in 2016 was post-truth. We're horrified when politicians use, in fact abuse, their position of power and privilege to assert falsehoods. And we're right to have a hair trigger and to question all those in authority, skeptical of their agendas. But we need to see that the earliest Christians had none of the power, none of the vested interests, none of the platform and privilege from which to proclaim their message. And yet something about that message, and Jesus of Nazareth, the man at the middle of it, meant that they kept going and going. What was it? Ultimately, we need to make sense of him to understand how the Bible as we have it ever got written at all. We need to go to these writings to see what we make of him. Let me put it this way. Given the raw ingredients of just 3 years in the public eye, 12 haphazard and incompetent followers, the unpromising environment of a Galilean backwater, no money to spend, no armies to fight for him, and the end of it all, a public humiliating death, given that and only that, Jesus began a movement that is growing to this day, such that 2 billion people and counting seriously call this homeless carpenter's son God. How did that ever get going? Because as much as we today can use archaeology and manuscript criticism to test these claims, and I invite you to do it, they were even more testable back then, even more dismissible back then. Think about it. If someone claims that a well-known prominent figure was crucified and then left behind an empty tomb and rose again from the dead, changing the city as it was, you could investigate that claim. You could go to Jerusalem and find out. Now, we'll think a bit about this on Friday when we think about this question of whether Jesus rose from the dead. But writing in his first letter to the Corinthians, Paul throws down exactly that gauntlet. On another occasion, Paul even says that these things weren't done in a corner when he's put on trial. He's referring to events that anyone could have tested. The church was born and grew up in the city of Jerusalem, and right from the beginning, they were proclaiming a Messiah who died and rose again in that very city. And this was a message that the authorities were eager to suppress and refute. And in fact, they held all the cards. So if what these New Testament writers said was so untrue, if it was such a dodgy representation of a Jesus that everyone in the area actually saw and knew, why did anyone ever believe it? Or think it was worth copying and disseminating these texts at great financial and social costs? Recently in The Guardian, there was an interview with a historian from Cambridge, Richard Evans. He was involved in the case against David Irving, the Holocaust denier, and his experiences are being made into a film called Denial. I don't know if it's out yet, but it looks very interesting. And in the interview, Richard Evans said that in this film he had this goal. He wanted to convince people watching it that there is such a thing as truth, and you can discover it. That history matters, and it's worth digging into. Now, whatever else we say about the Bible, and I'm looking forward to your questions, the New Testament, simply viewed as history, comes up with the goods. And they present an individual life of world-changing significance so that you can investigate the truth and discover it for yourself. And can I say, this story of Jesus has had more of an impact on our world than I can describe. It's in the Bible that we find the story that gives us our high view of human dignity. Just to give you one example of this, here's the philosopher and writer David Bentley Hart. He's reflecting on the moment in the Gospels in which Peter, one of the early Christian leaders, denies Jesus and then breaks into tears. And writing about this moment of emotion on the part of Peter, he writes this: "But when one compares this scene from the Gospels to the sort of emotional portraiture one finds in great Roman writers, comic or serious, one discovers, as the great literary critic Erich Auerbach noted half a century ago, that it's only in Peter that one sees the image of man in the highest and deepest and most tragic sense. Yet Peter remains, for all that, a Galilean peasant. This is not merely a violation of good taste. It's an act of rebellion. The Bible is the text that contains that act of rebellion, the one that would ennoble peasants like Peter by telling them that they're made in God's image and their emotions are significant. The one which ennobles those on the margins by telling them that the God who made everything has stepped into reality as one of them and died for them. The one that ennobles sufferers by telling them that God who made everything is a fellow sufferer, one who joins them in that. It is the story that has given us the most remarkable portrait of humanity in the life of Jesus, with commands so famous that even today, 20 centuries later, they're the high pinnacle of human ethical thought. So, is the Bible just a book of myths? Well, if by myth you mean something untrustworthy, unreliable, and untrue, obviously not. But if by myth you mean a story big enough to make sense of us as we are, then yes, the Bible delivers that. It is a true myth, if you like. It's the story to end all stories because it's true. The 20th century writer G.K. Chesterton reflected on the message of Jesus, saying this: "It met the mythological search for romance by being a story, and the philosophical search for truth by being a true story. That's why the ideal figure had to be a historical character, as nobody had ever felt Adonis or Pan to be a historical figure. But that is also why the historical character had to be the ideal figure." Have any of you read or seen Life of Pi? If you had, you'll know that at the end of the book, end of the film, Pi has told two very different stories, one of which is brutal and ugly, but presumably true. The other of which is beautiful and redemptive, impossible to believe. And at the end, Pi asks his audience, which do you prefer? Well, when we look at the Bible, the question that comes at us is, what if you didn't have to choose? What if you didn't have to choose between the story that was good and the story that was true? The claim that Christians would make about the Bible is that when they read it, and when they look at the person of Jesus, they find the story that is beautiful enough to carry the weight of their dreams and their hopes and their burdens, and true enough to meet their desire for meaning and intellectual satisfaction. It's the one that reaches in and scratches our itch for romance and epic and heroism, but doesn't spurn our calls for evidence and reliable, trustworthy witnesses. What if you didn't have to choose? That's what Christians say they found in the Bible. And we would love to invite you for the rest of this week to make your own exploration, to see what you make of this story.